Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for late start because of overrunning of the previous meeting. I know Stephen got to go, say, in 10 minutes. So what I think is I will let Shibu to do the quick introduction, then Stephen will talk.
I'm just about to tell Boss Sen about, Sen, get Stephen to go first.
Okay, so in the case, yes, I think Stephen is very, very fluent with what is happening. They were kind enough to allocate a lot of time for Tamil people to listen to the current issues we are facing. So I'll let Stephen to say a few words first.
Thank you very much, Sen, and I apologise for having to leave early, but I've got the opportunity to meet with a Welsh Government Minister about a very important issue in my constituency, and he's only here today, so I have to do that, unfortunately, so I'm very sorry that I have to leave you very shortly, but I thought it might be useful to say a few words about the position that we're taking on Sri Lanka, and it's been fantastic to work with Sen and Tamils for Labour, who've been incredibly helpful and supportive in terms of assisting us with developing our position on the deeply troubling situation in Sri Lanka and what we should be concretely pushing for now. So if you will permit me, I will just rattle through our asks, really, the key points, because I find foreign policy, people are very good at urging things and pushing for things and saying things, but it very rarely gets backed up with action. So what we're trying to do in Labour's new and emerging foreign policy right across the board is to focus on areas where action needs to be taken and where the British government is clearly not doing enough. Obviously the key discussion here is around the draft resolution 31, which is the basis for holding the Sri Lankan government accountable for the atrocities that have been committed in Sri Lanka, and particularly, of course, against the Tamil people. And we were very pleased to see a new resolution coming forward. We feel that the UK government could and should have been doing more as the pen holder, but that the resolution is a decent basis, but there's still some very serious questions that need to be asked. The resolution doesn't make any commitment to universal or extraterritorial jurisdiction, so why not? If there are opportunities for some of the people who are accused of having committed genocidal acts in Sri Lanka, when they are outside Sri Lankan territory, the resolution should give the basis for arresting them and prosecuting them under different jurisdictions. We've got a big question mark about why the government has failed to include a commitment to a triple IM basis for investigating the crimes against humanity that have taken place in Sri Lanka, because triple IM would give so much more capability and resources to the Human Rights Commissioner. We think that there's a clear case for referring a number of senior members of the Sri Lankan military and government to the International Criminal Court, and we don't understand why the British government hasn't done that. They say it's because they're worried about a veto from China and Russia, but should our foreign policy really be being determined by whether or not China and Russia are going to wield the veto in the Security Council? The report will come back in 18 months. That's too long. The evidence is already available. We know what's been going on. The Sri Lankan government will then just have more time to obstruct and obfuscate and kick things into the long grass. So the 18-month time frame should be shortened. There's a range of other issues which don't relate directly to the resolution. We need to understand why there aren't sanctions. Magnitsky sanctions need to be put in place. I've written to the government. There's a compelling set of pieces of evidence around senior generals in the Sri Lankan army, and of course those who are now running the country, being a clear basis for Magnitsky sanctions against them. We've also got strange things like there's a defence advisor in the British High Commission in Colombo who seems to be working with senior commanders of the Sri Lankan military. What's the content of those conversations? Why are those conversations taking place? Why do we have a military attaché in Colombo who is apparently working behind closed doors with people who are very credibly accused of perpetrating human rights atrocities. And then a big piece around trade. We've heard leaked comments from the previous Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab about them being prepared to do trade deals with countries that are committing human rights violations. We also saw how they refused the genocide amendment to the trade bill. Will the British government rule out the possibility of doing a trade deal with Sri Lanka? Because if they don't, then the idea that we might put human rights at the heart of our trade policy is completely and utterly for the birds. So there's a list of things that we're pushing on. We have done so in letters and also in debates in Parliament. We're not receiving satisfactory answers, and until we do receive satisfactory answers, I can assure you that we shall continue to put the pressure on and to ensure that we finally have a government that is prepared to have some values and some ethics in the way that it deals with the rest of the world. Thanks very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. I know Stephen got to go. Welcome, Lisa, and I hope you can stay a bit longer. Another half an hour.
I can't actually, said I'm really sorry. We've squeezed this in because it really matters to me to come, but we've got a debate on the floor in the hall starting right now, so I've just literally run in here as quickly as I could just to say hello to you all.
Okay, so what I propose is let's Francis make a quick start on your subject for 3 minutes, then Lisa can go. Lisa. Okay. So why not then I do my introduction so that you get a feel for what we feel, and then take your response and carry it on from there. Thank you very much. So just this year marks the 13th year since the Mullawaikal massacre, everyone knows. Not only that, it's 73 years since the independence. For the past 73 years, the Tamils in Sri Lanka have been victims and survivors of the genocide executed by the Sri Lankan state. The recent campaigns by the diaspora Tamils and the international NGOs brought the knowledge about this continuous genocide of Tamils by the consecutive Sri Lankan singular governments to the world, and in particular to the legislators of various countries around the world. We are very grateful for the work done by the NGOs, legislators, and the international community. In Britain, we have the Labour Party working with the Tamils shoulder to shoulder to bring out these injustices and hold the British government and UN institutions to account. In the recent Geneva resolution, I think Lisa and Stephen's team actively worked behind the scenes to change the government policy here. Thank you very much for that. On the other hand, we have a conservative government not at all bothered about the human rights or international justice, but busy working with and supporting regimes that are blatantly violating international laws and carrying out genocide. They are refusing to impose sanctions on senior government and military figures accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. By giving Sri Lanka and other genocidal regimes a seat at the table, continuing to advocate trade without demanding for adherence to international law and human rights, or imposing sanctions, the conservative government is part of the dangerous international community concerned with the economic and trading affairs rather than human lives. We have around 500,000 Tamils living and working in the UK, still worrying about their loved ones in Sri Lanka. The rape, torture, disappearances, abductions, unlawful killings, and various forms of human rights violations are carried out by armed forces and in some cases even by the Sri Lankan politicians. As refugees and survivors of a brutal civil war, we are continuously relieving trauma from the current media reports about the ongoing persecution of Tamils and Muslims in Sri Lanka, as well as hearing the experiences from our parents, siblings, relatives, and friends. The lives of the disappeared during the civil war and the aftermath of white vans abductions not answered yet. The parents and siblings of the disappeared are campaigning for the past 1,660 days continuously, as they truly believe the UN and the international government will deliver justice to them. all the Tamils are in agreement that an international independent investigation via ICC or ICJ can only deliver justice and lasting peace to them, and the current focus is to get this done. We are looking to the Labour Party to force the current British government to work with other governments and international bodies to deliver justice to the Tamil people. As a final point, we have started our political campaign in 2006 by setting up Tamils for Labour to show our people politics will work. However, 15 years on, we are struggling to convince them that this is the case. But the reality so far in Sri Lanka is that the state is killing and inflicting genocidal acts on Tamils, and the world is looking the other way. We trust our Labour Party and the international team will step up their efforts. I'm not saying we are not doing it already, but we need to see the results. For example, we want Savendra Silva to be banned and sanctioned in UK, whereas he has been already sanctioned in America. So I just want to prove to our people, not just here, all over the world, that politics will work. Thank you very much. So I ask Lisa to say a few words so that, yes.
Oh, lovely, and thank you so much. And I'm so sorry to do that usual conference thing of running in late and leaving early, but I did so want to be here today, and I wanted to start by saying Vanakkam. And it is a real pleasure to be able to be in the same room with you all finally. Sen and I and Stephen have been meeting over Zoom for the last 18 months, and it makes a real difference to be able to come together and show our support for the Tamil community. And I wanted to thank Sen very much for everything that you do and Tamils for Labour do. You're a strong voice for the Tamil community, but you're also a strong campaigning force for the Labour Party, and you matter enormously to us. I'm very proud to be here today. I wanted to say as well that we've got a number of people in the room. I've just spotted Barry Gardner, who's just sneaked in, Dawn Butler, Stephen Timms, and of course Siobhan McDonough, who is absolutely tireless in her support for upholding the human rights of people in Sri Lanka. That's the easiest round of applause I've ever got. I think I might just stop there. But I did want to say to you as well, Sen, that thank you for this and for the briefing and for the regular briefings and lobbying that you do of Stephen and I. And we certainly don't take it with any offence when you say that you want Labour to do more. We very much welcome the constructive challenge that you present to the front bench, and long may that continue. I wanted to say to you all as well that as having the pleasure of addressing you as the Shadow Foreign Secretary for the first time, that upholding human rights and the rule of law, freedom and democracy will always be an essential component of Labour's foreign policy. It's true in the Robin Cook, and it will continue to be true under Keir Starmer's leadership. And we don't just talk the talk, we want to walk the walk, which is why we've been pushing the government so hard in order to live those values in practice. As Stephen was saying to you, we pushed in March for the UN Human Rights Council resolution, which included concrete measures such as an international independent investigative mechanism and referral of cases to the International Criminal Court. These concrete steps are really important to us, but more than that, we know that they're important to the Tamil community, and we know, thanks to the compelling testimony of many of you in this room, we know why and we feel it. Tomorrow I'm going to set out a bit more about Labour's approach to foreign policy in the hall, and we will reaffirm our commitment to be guided by a moral compass when it comes to foreign policy, with human rights at its centre. If you threaten human rights anywhere, you threaten human rights everywhere, and that will be our mantra. So thank you so much for
Thank you very much. So, our next speaker is Francis Harrison. And Francis is working with the Tamil Community International Truth and Justice Project, where she has done the real hard work by meeting the victims and got so much information and worked with the INGOs in UK as well. So can I ask Francis to say?
How many minutes do you want me to speak for? Okay, thank you very much, Sen, for having us. And we really treasure the relationship we have with the Tamil community, and I hope that we are of some service and use to you in the work we do. I just wanted to point out maybe a few things that arose in the previous speakers' speeches. There was a UN resolution in March, and it does give 18 months for the UN to go back to the Human Rights Council, but now there's only 12 months left. And it did establish a mechanism to gather evidence for Sri Lanka and to store it for the future, but that hasn't started yet. And the reports we see on the media are that the funding for that mechanism has been cut by 58% this year, which basically leaves the mechanism without a boss and without sort of like a body without a head and without legs. So that is really concerning to us, that whether or not this body really is going to come into action. And obviously now it's only a year to gather evidence, to analyse it, to send it to prosecutors, to send it to sanctions bodies. That's an enormous task that has to go on for many, many years and needs to be properly funded. And at the moment, there's a great deal of uncertainty about that mechanism. So, we get a lot of letters back from the Foreign Office saying, oh yes, it's okay, we supported this mechanism, but I'm a bit concerned that the mechanism is becoming a kind of fig leaf for inaction, because it's not functioning yet and it's not clear how much it's going to have in terms of teeth. We mentioned the issue of Shivendra Silva. He's the army commander in Sri Lanka. He is designated under appropriations law in the United States. That means he and his entire family cannot go there, cannot get visas. He's designated after a very arduous process of investigating the kinds of gross violations of human rights that he's alleged to have committed in Sri Lanka at the end of the war. And we engaged with the United States on that process, and we've done a similar submission to the Foreign Office in the UK, asking for him to be sanctioned under Magnitsky here. And it's a very different process in the UK. So I would say that here it's really as if the information we share with the Foreign Office goes into a black hole. There's no interaction, there's no sense in which they discuss, what do you have in the way of detailed command structure for this incident or anything like that. It's just thank you very much, we'll keep the file open. So that's, I think, very disappointing from an evidence-based organisation like ourselves that's been involved in doing universal jurisdiction cases, both in Latin America and in the United States against senior army and political figures in Sri Lanka. And we've spent many, many years collecting evidence to the level of the prosecution, and we've shared that with the Foreign Office, and we are not really getting the runaround about whether or not there's any action that they can take as a result. So the impression we get is that the process for Magnitsky's submission assessment is not transparent, and there's no review process, there's no appeal process. We understand there is going to be an all-parliamentary party group set up for Magnitsky, and I really hope that the Labour Party will play a role in that, an important role in asking questions about why, for example, Sri Lankans are not being sanctioned. Because I think for the community, that's the very lowest level of accountability that they're looking for, and obviously their aspirations are much higher than just sanctions. So, that's one point. I think the other issue that I think Sonia will also speak about is the ongoing engagement with Sri Lanka from the UK. So we had a very active role in previous years in terms of training the Sri Lankan police, and that's the Scottish Police, but also the Financial Crimes Investigation Division, the Serious Fraud Office of Sri Lanka, if you like, which has subsequently been more or less disbanded. So that's a waste of taxpayers' money. That's £750 million that went into helping them investigate financial crimes. And a lot of money went into helping the Sri Lankan police, who, in terms of the information that we're gathering, and in the past, Freedom from Torture have also gathered, are continuing to commit very serious violations like torture and sexual violence. So we have been looking at very recent cases of people who are arriving in the UK this year and last year. This year, Tamils who are arriving on rubber dinghies across the channel, risking their lives to get here, and they're literally put on a boat. They can take no possessions. One guy recently I met, he was on a boat with 32 people from different countries, and they were given enough fuel to get across the middle line of the channel, but not to get to the English coast. And they were given a mobile phone with some numbers for the Coast Guard programmed in it. And one guy phoned, you could speak English, but they were on a boat with Afghans, Sri Lankan Tamils, people from Africa, as he puts it, rich country, babies, children. And then he got here, and when I met him a month later, he'd been in quarantine, and then he'd gone to stay with distant family friends. he was wearing the clothes that the Coast Guard or the authorities gave him at Dover, so not his own clothes, because everything was soaked, he lost everything he possessed. And he was too ashamed to ask for help, to ask for, spell change of clothes or a toothbrush or anything. So that's the state that people are coming in. He was 26 years old. He'd been tortured and sexually violated by counter-terrorism police, with whom we may well have a relationship after the Easter Sunday bombings, I don't know, in Jaffna. And he had a good future in Jaffna. He was educated, he had a professional job. There was no reason, the only reason he fled was because he feared for his life. He left his family behind. These are, what we see are increasingly young Tamil men coming here who were far too young to be in the NTT, to have fought in the war, and who are being brutally violated by the Sri Lankan police and army still this year and last year. So when we're talking about accountability and when the Tamil community is speaking about justice and sanctions and the ICC and so on, it's not just about what happened in Murugapur in 2009, it's what's continuing to happen now that needs to be taken care of, needs to be noted. So in that context, when you see the British High Commissioner in Colombo, exchanging gifts with the Sri Lankan Army Commander, the one that we talked about sanctioning, or various kinds of engagements with the Scottish police, training the Sri Lankan police, it's very, very difficult for somebody who's Tamil, who is part of this community or who has friends who are victims, to see that kind of engagement going on. And really, as a taxpayer, it's an affront to us as well that this is still happening. So I would urge you to take on the issue of police training, take on vetting and screening of the diplomats who come here, make sure the vetting and screening of the UN peacekeepers who go abroad from Sri Lanka is properly done in Geneva, because at the moment it's not being done, and that Magnitsky sanctions are applied not just to Shivendra Silva but other Sri Lankan army generals, and we will be putting in more submissions for sanctions, detailed documents to the Foreign Office, but it is very demoralising when you don't get a proper response. So, I hope that.
I think this was again time to thank you for all your hard work on our issues and all the help you have been giving. Our next speaker is Subhashini. So Subhashini is a solicitor and a human rights activist, and she will say a few words.
I will keep this very brief because I know that we have a little bit of time and there's two more fantastic speakers after me. But in essence, I'm part of a group of people that are looking towards referring and making some communications to under Article 15 to the International Criminal Court. Over the number of years, we've had a number of people that have come in, moved to the UK and lived lives but suffered torture and inhumane and degrading treatment in the hands of the Sri Lankan government. And one of the things that we're looking to do is take the possibility, exploring it, of taking Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court of Justice as well, under the Genocide Convention, Convention of Torture and other cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment, punishment, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. For that, we do need a UK government that is prepared to make that referral as well to the International Court of Justice. At the moment, the only sort of door that is open for us is to go to the International Criminal Court with referrals for hopefully a prosecutor to examine the evidence. However, without the state backing, this is a big uphill battle that we're going through at the moment. As speakers before me may have said, the massacres, the tortures and everything else really started decades ago, from 1948, 1973, and then the 80s riots. And all of these things we come in with a lot of, as far back as close as 2009, but even after that in more recent history as well. So we're asking for a UK Labour government to support us in a referral to the ICJ, as well as support our endeavours in referring to the ICC. In his Mulabaikal statement of May 2020, the party leader, Keir Starmer Police Council, said, perpetrators of atrocity, crimes against humanity, against Tamils must be brought to justice. Based on the commitment he gave, we strongly expect the Labour Party to support the initiatives taken to redress the grave crimes committed by the Sri Lankan state at the ICJ and the ICC. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Shibu Mizuno, the vice chair of the Old Party Parliamentary Group, and a great friend of Tamils. Ever since we set up the Tamils for Labour in 2006, almost every meeting attended by Shibu, and a great help to us. So, Shibu.
Hi everybody, I have such a long list of speakers. I'm sure that there are few things I could add other than to thank everybody for being here. A lasting memory seared in my brain is to see the whole London Tamil community out on Parliament Square in the days running up to the culmination of the Civil War. And nobody was listening. Nobody was listening. A hard-working, entrepreneurial, determined community had all of a sudden left their colleges and left their businesses and left their work in complete despair that their family were being bombed by the government of their own country, and nobody was listening. And this happened for complex and for difficult reasons, but all of a sudden the Tamils were left without any friends internationally. The only friend that they had ended up being David Miliband, our Foreign Secretary at the time, who, when I reflect back on it, sometimes you don't realise how amazing things were at the time, but when you look back, as Foreign Secretary, we brought in groups of Tamils to meet him in the Foreign Office, lots of students who we were simply worried would harm themselves if they couldn't feel that somebody was listening. And that experience for me made me absolutely determined that I would continue to do everything I could to help the Tamil community and not look the other way. To try and both help the community to develop political links in the mainstream politics right around the world, but also to stand up to the Sri Lankan government. And at times we have been completely outfoxed by the Tory government. How could David Cameron be able to go to Sri Lanka and allow the Commonwealth Conference to take place there and to win plaudits for doing it? How can the Rajapaksas be back controlling the government of Sri Lanka when there are all sorts of allegations of war crimes, of corruption, of nepotism? And I can't tell you just how difficult it has been to get our current government to do anything. I'm just here to say I and my other colleagues in the room, Stephen Timms and Barry, all of us, we are here, and we are here because we have a history and we know the difficulties. And we, together with Dawn and Wes Streeting, who is not here, and so many Labour MPs, we will be there to do our best. But our best will only be our best when we can get ourselves back into government and actually doing something for real, rather than standing at the sidelines and shouting about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shibu. I think, as Shibu said, when we had so much difficulties, Shibu and many other MPs who are here were with us in Parliament Square, helping us to keep going. You mentioned David Miliband. People used to say we had, 40,000 people got killed in the last 2 weeks. If he didn't go and plead and brought the attention of the world, it could have been much higher. But sadly, still this is going on. I think that's the issue. I will ask Abrabi to speak next. She's the UK Advocacy Officer for People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, called Pearl, and I'll ask her to say a few words. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me as part of this amazing, super strong panel. Really glad to be here. Pearl appreciates the continued support the Labour Party has given the Tamil community in their efforts to secure justice for the atrocities committed against them, as well as efforts for self-determination. Unfortunately, the lack of tangible bilateral pressure from successive British governments on Sri Lanka has let Sri Lanka get away with a continued impunity. The UK is currently at the forefront of ensuring justice and accountability for Sri Lanka's war crimes at the UNHRC. But Sri Lanka is yet to establish a judicial mechanism or deliver criminal justice on emblematic cases as outlined in the UNHRC resolutions, and by allowing Sri Lanka to keep failing on fulfill international commitments, the credibility of the UNHRC as a mechanism for promoting accountability severely continues to be undermined. Sri Lanka must face tangible consequences for its brazen rejection of this process. No Sri Lankan government has ever addressed the root causes of the ethnic conflict, including structural discrimination against the Tamil nation since the island's independence. It is evident that the calls for from the Tamil community in Sri Lanka for a long-term political solution through self-determination is very much alive today, as we saw through the PTP protests that took place across the northeast of Sri Lanka at the start of the year, despite increasing surveillance and harassment by security forces, and as much of the Tamil community worldwide continues to call for now. The Tamil community in Sri Lanka continues to resist the Sinhala Buddhist majoritarian state. We in the UK are blessed to live in a society that enables us to freely observe memorialisation events such as Mavidanal and Mullivaikal, but the Tamil community in Sri Lanka is not afforded this basic right to memorialisation. Peaceful events are unjustly criminalised and still take place under severe harassment and surveillance from the Sri Lankan military. Just a few days ago, a Tamil MP was brutally manhandled and arrested just for participating in one of these memorialisation events. It is vital that the right to remember is protected, as this is integral for the healing of the Tamil community from the atrocities and violence that has been taking place over the past several decades and continue to occur now. International support and visibility for the Tamil struggle for accountability and self-determination is key in empowering Tamil civil society in the diaspora, and importantly on the ground in the northeast. When Tamil politicians and civil society on the ground see British MPs and other governments abroad continue to pressure the Sri Lankan government, it inspires and empowers them to continue their work for an equitable future in Sri Lanka. The fight for justice and accountability for the atrocity crimes, including the genocide of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, spans across generations. Time has not at all played a part in diminishing these calls for justice from the Tamil community, as thousands of British Tamil youth continue to watch how the UK engages with Sri Lanka in the context of human rights. Therefore, PALC asks that Labour continues to work with the British Tamil community in calling for accountability and justice for Sri Lanka's war crimes, because the fight is far from over. We ask that the Labour MPs continue to push the UK government to review the preferential trade scheme it currently has in place with Sri Lanka, as well as any other incoming trade scheme with the UK that Sri Lanka is privy to, and make it contingent on a human rights monitoring mechanism as the EU has, sustainable progress on security sector reform and the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and Sri Lanka's recommitment to UNHRC Resolution 30/1, as well as continuing to push for an international accountability mechanism into the allegations of genocide against Tamils by Sri Lanka. We ask Labour MPs continue to call for the use of international judicial mechanisms such as referral to the ICC, as was talked about earlier on, or the International Court of Justice to persecute those who have been credibly accused of atrocity crimes. We ask that our Labour MPs continue to be vocal on the UK's sanctioning of war criminals to show our commitment to justice and accountability by calling for the use of universal jurisdiction and sanctions mechanisms to open investigations, and calling for the UK government to be consistent in its sanctioning of other human rights violators, and to sanction the Sri Lankan officials accused of these crimes as well. We ask that the Labour MPs continue to push to make UK military engagement and funding contingent on security sector reform, including the removal of personnel involved in human rights violations from Sri Lanka's security forces. We ask that Labour continues to make public statements showing concern about the current situation in Sri Lanka and showing support of Tamil and Muslim communities, and continue to engage with the Tamil constituents. We also ask for Labour to update the wording in its manifesto commitment on Tamils in Sri Lanka to include wording on supporting efforts for an international accountability mechanism and a political solution on the island that supports the right to self-determination for all communities. Thank you for your time, and we hope that Labour continues to engage with Tamil organisations to centre our voices and to continue to provide a space for us at the table so that we can all fight for justice together.
Thank you, Amrali, for the research speech and for continuous support, particularly for Pearl. taking care of what's happening. And this is also time for me to acknowledge, as Shibu and Lisa said, for the MPs here, Stephen Timms, he's there and he's very, very helpful and all the time there for the Tamil community. Barry Gardner here, Don Butler here, and Robert Evans, when he was the MEP, he was so helpful to us. He did campaign for us in Europe, which we very much appreciate. We are out of Europe now. I hope you can continue to still help us with your colleagues in what's going on there. And for example, the European MEPs are there in Sri Lanka assessing whether they should continue the GSP or not, sort of thing. So thank you, and our councillors here as well. So our next speaker is Sonia, again CEO of Freedom from Torture. Sonia will explain, I think, like Francis, they also work continuously in Sri Lanka, particularly for the Tamil people who got affected so much. And Sonia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sen, and to the Tamils for Labour group, and to Siobhan and Lisa and Stephen who've been on the panel here tonight. It is a real pleasure to be here with you. As Sen said, I'm Sonja Skeets and I'm the Chief Executive of Freedom from Torture, which is one of the largest torture rehabilitation centres in the world. We have been watching on in horror in recent years at a global authoritarian turn, which is turning liberal democracies into countries prepared to stand by in the face of human rights abuses. And the torture ban in particular is one that there is a lapse in commitment to. Sri Lanka is perhaps one of the worst examples of all. We've just gotten rid of President Donald Trump, who proudly said that torture absolutely works. Here in Britain, Prime Minister Boris Johnson was narrowly stopped by us and many others from passing legislation that would have effectively decriminalised torture committed by British troops serving abroad in Iraq and Afghanistan. But in Sri Lanka, we have the real deal. Gotabaya Rajapaksa is actually personally accused of responsibility for torture. This is the president of a democracy. So we worry about that greatly, and we have tremendous experience, I'm very sad to say, of supporting survivors of torture from Sri Lanka. Almost all of them Tamil, but not all. We have worked with Sinhalese survivors as well. Between 2009 and 2019, our specialist doctors forensically documented more than 550 cases of Sri Lankans who had been brutally tortured in Sri Lanka. It is by far the biggest client group that we help at Freedom from Torture, and so we have been working with Siobhan, many of the people on this panel and others to draw attention to torture practices in Sri Lanka, including ongoing torture since the end of the Civil War. We haven't had any survivors coming into our service who have been tortured under the current presidency, but you've heard this evening from Francis, whose group ITJP has been working with Sri Lankans who've arrived, including very recently. And I'm going to come back to what this means for what we need to be doing in relation to the anti-refugee bill as well. Ongoing impunity for torture is an enormous problem. So many of the panellists this evening have spoken in very powerful ways about that, and I just endorse what has been said about the need to keep the pressure up on the UK government to be in turn doing what it can be doing bilaterally and in multilateral fora to increase the pressure on Sri Lanka to deliver accountability for war crimes, other international crimes, including torture. But the UK continues to send mixed signals to Sri Lanka. It is true, as we've heard this evening, that the UK has been a really powerful supporter inside the Human Rights Council in Geneva for ongoing pressure on Sri Lanka. But in all sorts of other ways, it's pointing in the other direction. You know, the elevation of trade interests over human rights concerns and the need for accountability is a real problem in the foreign policy of the Conservative government. And we heard from Francis earlier about these terrible policing arrangements. Police Scotland have for, I think around 15 years been providing support to the Sri Lankan police. In some cases, we suspect the very same parts of the police that are responsible for the torture that Freedom from Torture and ITJP and others have been documenting. This policing arrangement has continued despite the complete absence of serious security sector reform on the island since the end of the Civil War. So what do we think that Labor can do to help? I'm going to make 5 points, 3 of which focus on foreign policy and the international dimension, and 2 of which relate to the refugee situation here and the agenda of this government on that count. So firstly, like many of the other speakers this evening, Freedom from Torture lends our support to the calls for the UK to be using our global human rights sanctions regime to place sanctions on key Sri Lankans who have been credibly accused of involvement in international crimes. We've heard about Army Commander Shavendra Silva, but the Defence Secretary Kamal Gunratne is another one who we think should be on that list. We are calling, together with the Sri Lanka campaign and others, for a complete halt to engagement on the part of Police Scotland with the Sri Lankan security sector. The training program needs to be cancelled immediately, and we should be calling for the withdrawal of the defence advisor, the UK's defence advisor, who is stationed over in Sri Lanka. We are calling also for a review of the preferential trade tariffs for Sri Lanka on the basis of its commitment to good governance and human rights, and for a timetable for those trade preferences to be removed if certain conditions, including the repeal of the Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act, are not met. And it's been really interesting at conference today hearing such a groundswell of support within the Labor Party for an increase in pressure on the trade front. Now on to the asylum system. Almost all of the Sri Lankans who we support at Freedom from Torture are asylum seekers or refugees, and they have an absolutely, as the MPs in the room will be able to attest, they have an absolutely terrible time securing protection from the Home Office. It is absolutely heartbreaking, even when their cases are supported by forensic independent reports prepared by our doctors, they are still failing for all kinds of reasons, including very, very flawed country information and policy from the Home Office. And so this is one of the other areas where the pressure needs to be kept up on the government to make sure that those policies and that information is accurate. And then secondly, we are calling on everybody in this room to resist the anti-refugee bill, otherwise known as the Nationality and Borders Bill. Freedom from Torture has rechristened it the anti-refugee bill because that is what it is. You heard earlier from Francis about Sri Lankans who are arriving on those dinghies. Under this legislation, if it is to be passed, those people would be criminalised. They would be denied protection and ejected from the UK. There would be an increase in the use of draconian immigration detention centres. This is the most incredible assault on the principle of refugee protection that we have seen here since the end of the Second World War. The legislation would drive a coach and horses through the Refugee Convention by reversing the principle, which was the great achievement of that convention, that whether you qualify for refugee status depends not on the mode of your arrival or whether you had pre-authorisation to arrive, but on whether you met the internationally agreed definition of a refugee. All of that will be turned on its head if this bill is allowed to pass. This is a piece of legislation that is before Parliament right now, and there is the most incredible groundswell of opposition that is building. The biggest refugee rights coalition movement in British history has been built. The Together with Refugees coalition, more than 300 organisations have signed up to that, and people across the country are mobilising. If you haven't signed Freedom from Torture's petition against that bill, please do it tonight. We've had more than 52,000 signatures. It's the biggest petition Freedom from Torture has ever run. And there are many other groups that are running similar petitions, and we're going to be adding them all together. So please, to all of the Labor MPs in the room, do what we need you to do in relation to that bill. And for all of you otherwise who are in this room, please help us by showing your representatives that this is not a piece of legislation that you want being passed in your name. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. So thank you for the audience to come here all the way. The particular people came all the way for this event only today. Thank you very much again. We really appreciate what you have done. And also my special thanks to all the panel who prepared all these things properly, and also for your continuous support. Thank you very much.